next speaker, that is Blaine Curcio from Orbital Gateway Consulting, and he's also the senior advisor at Novaspace. So thank you very much for giving your precious time, Blaine. Welcome to the webinar again.
Well, thanks a lot, Omkar, for having me, and thank you to Juan and Shaju for those two really interesting talks. Hopefully, I can live up to that standard that has been set. I'm going to send a
Absolutely.
request to share my screen here.
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, I think the floor is yours, Blaine. And as everyone in the industry knows you as the China space guy, so really looking forward to your presentation.
Well, I'll see what I can do. And as you said,
Yes.
China space guy indeed. Can you see my screen?
No, we can't see your screen yet.
Really?
No, we can see. I can see your screen, Blaine.
Okay. And it's just the PowerPoint presentation, right, Shaju? That's all you see?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yes.
Okay. Cool. And Omkar, are you able to see it yet, or still?
Yeah, I'm able to see it now. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, as Omkar mentioned, I cover the Chinese space sector through my company, Orbital Gateway Consulting. And here I'm going to have a little bit more of a general talk about what China is doing in space, and then a little bit of commentary about what that means for ISR. So Blaine Curcio, founder of Orbital Gateway Consulting, Hong Kong company, and also a senior affiliate consultant at Novaspace, formerly Euroconsult and Space Tech Partners. We do research on the Chinese commercial space sector and also the government space sector. Our clients are primarily space agencies and governments in the US, Europe, and elsewhere. You can also find me on Substack. I write the China Space Monitor. And if you'd like to find me on LinkedIn, I sent my URL in the chat, but you can also just search for hashtag China Space Guy, and I will inevitably come up. So, short agenda, I'm going to give a brief backgrounder on the Chinese space sector and then talk about their evolving space capabilities, how that has changed over the last 10 or 11 years, and then conclusions, so what, why is it relevant to our conversation today? And so the brief backgrounder on the Chinese space sector, I think one of the things that most people in outside of China assume about the Chinese space sector is that it is completely controlled by the state and by state-owned enterprises. And up until 10 years ago, that was certainly true. And even today, that's largely true. Most of the Chinese space industry today is still large state-owned enterprises. And so the largest one, as we see in this flow chart, is CASC, so China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation. They have many dozens of subsidiaries, hundreds of subsidiaries that focus on things like building rockets, building satellites, et cetera. These subsidiaries all have, somewhat similar acronyms as names. So there's CAST, SAST, ALT, et cetera. You have other SOEs like CASIC, which is a more focused on missiles and other defense technology, but obviously there's a lot of overlap between, say, missiles and rockets. And so CASIC has been getting a little bit more involved in the space sector. And then you have a newer state-owned enterprise, this China Satellite Networks Limited, which was established to launch the so-called Chinese version of Starlink, the Guowang or SatNet project. There's some other state-controlled entities like the Chinese Academy of Sciences that play a pretty big role in the space sector, either directly. So you have a lot of Chinese Academy of Sciences institutes, for example, that build components for different satellites or that build, atomic clocks, let's say, for the Beidou navigation satellites, et cetera. But then you also have the Chinese Academy of Sciences spinning out commercial enterprises. And this has been a trend really in the last 10 or maybe 15 years in the case of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And that's created a pretty vibrant commercial ecosystem, if we can use that phrase in a fuzzy way. And then as we see here, these commercial companies down at the bottom, there are now, depending on how you define commercial space company, many hundreds of companies in China, many thousands if we want to expand the definition to companies that build, materials or that build thermal protected systems, this type of thing. So, I mean, generally speaking, you have, again, a very large state-owned sector, and this state-owned sector is responsible for most of the big missions that we hear about. So the Chinese space station, the Beidou satellite navigation, et cetera. And then you have this relatively smaller, but still large and vibrant and up and coming commercial sector that has really started to do some interesting things. And just to dig a little bit into how the traditional space sector has been structured, and how that's changing. But the traditional space sector has been very top down and very much based on national missions. So the example I give here in this diagram is this SASC, so the Eighth Academy of CASC. So CASC being the big one that I mentioned a moment ago. This Eighth Academy is sort of their Shanghai subsidiary, let's say. And within SASC, you have dozens of subsidiaries that are focused on very specific things. So we see the Shanghai Institute of Electronic and Communications Equipment, Shanghai Institute of Spacecraft Equipment. They then have their own subsidiaries doing things like composite materials and intelligent space equipment, et cetera. This whole apparatus was built in a very sort of quota-driven way. So these entities, their main purpose is to ensure that these large projects like the Beidou satellite navigation constellation are built on time and with a high level of reliability. And so what that has meant is that these companies are building a number of components that is appropriate for that one project. They're not really commercially oriented. It's more like we need the Shanghai Institute of Radio Equipment to build us X number of radio transmitters because we're going to build Y number of satellites, and this is the number that we need to build that number of satellites. So again, very top down, very much the companies are not necessarily thinking about how do we build more, how do we commercialize this, is there a way to expand our market, et cetera. It's really, we need to build a finite number of widgets at a high level of reliability in a timely manner, and probably cost is a consideration, but I would venture to say it's not the biggest consideration. I mean, they can't be just throwing money into a furnace, but at the same time, again, the bigger issue is launching these things on time, on budget, on time and with a level of reliability, I should say. Now, so this is basically how the Chinese space sector was structured up until 10 years ago. Is big company, relatively smaller subsidiary, many smaller sub-subsidiaries underneath that, and everything flowed from the top. So big company wins a contract to build Beidou, and then they give their contracts to all of their subsidiaries. This started to change around 2014, and what we've seen is commercial companies that are up and coming have set up their shops very near these existing state-owned enterprises. And the reason there is, up until 10 years ago, the only people who knew how to build rockets in China, for example, were the ones that were building rockets for the state. And so if you wanted to start a commercial launch company, you were recruiting from those places. And so we have here, it's a little bit dated from a couple of years ago, but this is a map of southeastern Beijing. And you see here is the China Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology. So CALT is the big state-owned launch manufacturer. They build the Long March 3, 5, 7, etc. And then we see this is maybe 8 or 10 kilometers away, a huge cluster of all the commercial launch companies that are located in the same kind of economic and technology development area, and that have a similar government incentives as to the main launch company. But basically you just have this clustering effect. And as we see alluded to here, there's a similar in the northwest of Beijing, a satellite manufacturing cluster where you have CAST, the big CASC subsidiary that builds satellites, and then you have 20 commercial satellite manufacturers. And this has caused some interesting issues. A few years ago, there was a situation where, 7 years ago now, a leading rocket scientist from a state-owned rocket company was hired by a commercial launch company for a salary that was several times their existing salary. And it created this national controversy about the state-owned launch company tried to sue the commercial launch company, saying, you're stealing our talent. And the rumor in China at the time is that this decision went all the way up to Xi Jinping, who then said, as long as the guy stays in China, it's okay that he goes to a commercial launch company. So I will never know if that rumor was true, because I don't think I'll ever get an audience with Xi Jinping. But in any case, that was the rumor at the time, and I think it serves as an example of some of the tension that's existed between the state-owned and the commercial sector. And so now to throw some numbers at this, how big is the commercial sector gotten, and what does it look like? So this is a chart of number of satellites and rockets launched by China, these two, the orange and blue bars, respectively, being satellites and rockets. And then this gray line is the percentage of the satellites that can be defined as commercial. And again, that word is a little bit fuzzy, but let's just go with it for now. And so as we see, I mean, the number of spacecraft launched in 2014 was about 30, and in 2024, it was about 275, so almost a tenfold increase in 10 years. And then we see the percentage of those spacecraft in 2014 that were commercial were zero. And by 2024, it was almost half of those spacecraft were commercial. And these commercial companies are doing a variety of different things, many of which are related to ISR, a lot of remote sensing, optical SAR, et cetera, but then also, enhanced navigation, GNSS occultation, et cetera. So basically, high level trend, big increase in the number of rockets and satellites launched, and also a big increase in commercial activity. And funding has followed a pretty similar path. So as recently as 2014, there was about 5 million US dollars in funding for commercial companies in China. And last year, the number was about 2.5 billion. And we see that 2024 was a record year. I would also point out, as we can see here, although pardon the vast array of colors, but we see that satellite communications has become a very big topic in the last few years, this green bar. There were several huge funding rounds last year in SATCOM. And this is a market change from, say, the late 2010s, when the gray bar, Earth observation, was the big trend. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. But in general, again, high level picture is big increase in funding and some level of evolution of where that funding has been going with regard to like type of companies. And again, just to show this SATCOM versus remote sensing dynamic. So we see here the number of remote sensing satellites that this launched by China, this orange bar, has really ramped up, but 2023, it did see a bit of a drop. And SATCOM has really started to ramp up. And I would mention that in 2025, we've seen already 18 communication satellites launched by China, possibly 19. But in any case, this evolution of remote sensing having been the order of the day at an earlier time, and there have been some remote sensing companies that got a little bit ahead of themselves, notably a company called CGSTL or Changguang, as some may know it. But basically, they had launched this very large constellation. It's now on orbit, and so they've tapered their launch cadence, and that has contributed to remote sensing seeing a little bit of a dip. But in any case, big picture takeaway here is that comms is in the ascendant right now, and primarily that's because of this Chinese response to Starlink, if we can put it so specifically. And just to give a little bit of a picture as to how these commercial space companies are moving so quickly, and maybe how they're moving so quickly. I mean, largely a lot of it is tech transfer. And so we look at this company, CGSTL, I mentioned a moment ago. They are, in my approximation, they might be the leading remote sensing company in the world. If we think about, they've built 150 of their own primarily optical remote sensing satellites. They've launched them. They're operating them. These are big satellites. They sell the data. I mean, they're a very competent remote sensing company. They spun out from the Chinese Academy of Sciences Changchun Institute of Optics and Precision Mechanics. So as you can imagine, a lot of the optical related technology that came from that institute has probably fed into their optical remote sensing satellites. We see similar things with a company called AirSat. They're launching a SAR constellation now. They're a spinoff from the Academy of Aerospace Information Research of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which is a leading SAR and radar manufacturer. Similarly with the Silk Road constellation, coming from the CETC 38th Institute, also a SAR company. And then this recent Thousand Sails constellation, which is one of the Chinese versions of Starlink. This is the spinoff from this Chinese Academy of Sciences Shanghai Engineering Center for Microsatellites, which is one of the leading satellite manufacturers in China. So, generally speaking, you have commercial companies that are benefiting from tech transfer and from other support, which we can also talk about later. But the tech transfer, I think, is the bigger picture point for this purposes of today. And then just to quickly wrap it up, I know I'm running over a little bit, but yeah, I mean, conclusion. So China's developing a variety of space-based ISR. This is, optical, remote sense, optical, SAR, hyperspectral, et cetera. And again, other enhanced navigation and just generally other types of technology. this is going to lead to improved information gathering. It already is. I mean, it's clear that China has a lot of satellites on orbit that are collecting a lot of information, and we only know about some of it. Indirectly, this is going to lead to oversupply, and this is something I talk about a lot in other fora. But this idea that, for example, Chinese electric vehicles are now, really putting pressure on Western car makers. 10 years ago, there were like 200 companies in China building electric cars, and everyone said, you can't have 200 companies, they're going to fail. And sure enough, 90% of them failed, but the ones that did not fail became BYD. And so I think if we think about the same dynamic, but with, say, rockets, where there's now 40 or 50 commercial launch companies in China, I don't think that the market can support 40 or 50 or even like 10. But in 5 or 10 years, probably 90% of those companies will have failed, and the 10% that survive will have survived a very difficult baptism by fire in a very competitive market. And so, maybe coming to a launch site near you. That's all I have for today. So I will stop my presentation and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Blaine, for interesting presentation. I think it's not so usual that we see such an insightful, I would say, facts and figures into the Chinese market. But so thank you very much to Blaine, because he's the one who, I think he's the possibly the only expert in the industry, I think, who keeps mining quite a lot of data and comes up with interesting insights into the Chinese space industry. I'll just look after if we have any questions for Blaine. So yeah, we have an anonymous attendee. So there are several other questions also, but specifically for Blaine, there's one question. Are Chinese space
Yes.
components widely used overseas if they could export? I think its supply chain would be interesting. So that's the complete question.
Sure. So I would say, I mean, it depends on how you define widely used, but yes, Chinese component companies are exporting components overseas. There's a bit of a spectrum of, more or less sensitive components, and some of the less sensitive components I've heard about are things like solar cells and that type of thing. I've also heard some interesting anecdotes. I mean, there's a rumor going around the Chinese space industry, but I've heard it from several people, that this company, Langyue Electromechanical, they're a manufacturer of reaction wheels and gyroscopes, that they have allegedly had some meetings with Starlink about providing them with some components. Now, I have no idea, but yes, I would say it's becoming more common. And I think with this oversupply issue that I alluded to at the very end, it will become even more common because, again, the Chinese market is not necessarily big enough to absorb all of this capacity of stuff. And maybe one last point I would mention, part of the reason for that is that, unlike Western space companies, whom I think are generally focusing on government and military right now because that's the best customer. In the Chinese space sector, the government and the military are still primarily doing business with the state-owned enterprises, which means that commercial companies, they really need to find relatively commercial ways to make money because there's just not that much government business for them. The government tends to be more supportive as a financier or like giving free land or other kind of subsidies. But that being the case, needing to find commercial ways to make money, they're looking to export markets, more so, let's say, than companies in countries that are more focused on their own government or military, let's say.
Interesting. And there are two more questions for you, Blaine. So the second last one is, any idea when the Chinese Starlink will be commercially available? This question is from Michelle Rain. Yeah.
Sure. So there's two companies. There's the Space Sail launching this 1,000 sails constellation. It's a relatively more commercial company. It's bankrolled by the Shanghai government and the CAS. But in any case, they've launched, well, they plan to have 648 satellites on orbit by the end of this year. I think that number is ambitious, but I think they could easily have 300 or 400. They currently have 72, and they're launching 18-ish per month. They recently announced an MOU with Telebras in Brazil. They also recently set up a subsidiary in Kazakhstan. So they're moving quickly, and they're already at least making initial commercial agreements in certain international markets. And so if I were to speculate, I would say probably sometime late next year or early 2027, we may start to see like actual commercial services. And it could be sooner, like just to, I mean, this space sale, they recently did in Hong Kong a test where they connected a cruise ship to their satellites. And I don't think that it was like a real commercial like that. I don't think there were people on the cruise ship using their satellite for internet access, but I think it's an indication that they're at a certain level of maturity in terms of downstream verticals. The other big company that's sort of the other Chinese version of Starlink is this Guowang or Satnet, and that's a fully state-owned, and they've moved a lot more slowly. They've only launched something like 20 satellites. Their first batch of 10 was launched back in December, but they've launched some onesies and twosies before that. In any case, I mean, they're a very well-funded state-owned enterprise, and so while they have moved very slowly up until now, it could happen that they would accelerate at some point. But I guess the short answer is, in the next 18 to 24 months, we should expect to see the Chinese version of Starlink be, at least sort of commercially available in some parts of the world.
And one last question before we move on to the next speaker. The next question is from Kunal Naik. What makes China's space commercial industry to move faster? Is it the supply chain within the Chinese market, or is it the government policy within the country?
I think it's a combination of factors. So I think even before any kind of commercialization, China had a very big space sector. There were a lot of SOEs that, CASC has 180,000 employees, for example. And so you had this big mass of know-how, of resources, et cetera. And then the government pretty proactively has said, we want more commercial space. We don't really know how we want it. We don't really know exactly what's going to open up first in terms of subsectors. But generally speaking, there is a strong tailwind for commercial space. And then you've seen many provincial and city governments fall into line behind that sentiment. And so almost every single leading Chinese commercial space company will have a city government or a provincial government or a Chinese Academy of Sciences research institute behind them, either financing or providing tech transfer or some combination thereof. And so I think it's a combination of big existing sector and somewhat clear government mandate to commercialize or open up the sector. And so, yeah, I think that those are the two big factors. And also, just maybe the last point I would mention is, for better or worse, I mean, Chinese capitalism in general moves pretty quickly. I spent 7 years of my life living in Shenzhen in the southern part of China, and they would talk about Shenzhen speed because the speed at which companies do things there is fast. It's a very fast moving place, and so I think that also probably plays a role.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Blaine.